She inherited her grandfather's crumbling barn filled with decades of junk. Everyone told her to just tear it down and sell the land. But when she found an old car hidden under tarps with the keys still inside and a mysterious map in the glove compartment, Sophia realized this wasn't just a barn full of trash. It was hiding a secret that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her family's past. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, what's the most mysterious thing you've ever found in an old building? The Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia stretched endlessly beyond the kitchen window of the weathered farmhouse, their rolling peaks painted in shades of amber and crimson by the late October sun. Sophia Castellanos sat at the scarred oak table that had been her grandfather's workspace for decades, surrounded by towers of legal documents, property deeds, and manila folders thick with a lifetime of careful record-keeping. At 29, she had built a comfortable existence as a librarian at the University of Richmond, her days filled with organizing archives, helping graduate students with research, and maintaining the quiet order that had always brought her peace. The farmhouse felt hollow without her grandfather's commanding presence. Antonio Castellanos had been a man who filled rooms simply by entering them, not through volume or bluster, but through the quiet authority that came from 7 decades of steady work and unwavering principles. He'd spent 43 years as a foreman at the Norfolk and Western Railway yards in Roanoke, rising before dawn every morning to supervise the loading and routing of freight cars that carried coal from the mountain mines to ports along the Atlantic coast. After retirement, he'd retreated to this property in the foothills of Shenandoah County, where he'd spent his final 20 years tending a small vegetable garden and maintaining the kind of meticulous routine that had served him well on the railroad. Sophia had been his only grandchild, the daughter of his son Carlos, who died in a construction accident when she was 12. Her grandmother had passed when Sophia was still in elementary school, leaving Antonio to navigate the complexities of raising a grieving child during summer visits that stretched from June through August. Those months had shaped her more than any other period of her life. Long days spent helping him repair fence posts, learning to identify edible plants in the surrounding forest, listening to his stories about the great steam engines that had once thundered through these mountain passes, carrying everything from furniture to livestock to the hopes of families heading west. Now the property was hers, the house with its hand-hewn beams and stone foundation, 67 acres of mixed woodland and pasture, and the massive barn that dominated the landscape like a cathedral built for storing hay rather than worshiping God. The structure had been erected in 1952, Antonio had told her, when this land was still part of the Whitmore Ranch, back when cattle grazed these hills and the sound of tractors working the fields could be heard from dawn until dusk. The barn had outlasted the ranch, outlasted 3 different owners, and now stood as a monument to an agricultural way of life that had long since given way to suburban developments and weekend retreats for city dwellers seeking mountain air. The inheritance brought complications that Sophia hadn't anticipated. Her librarian's salary, while sufficient for her modest Richmond apartment and her student loans, couldn't easily absorb the property taxes on nearly 70 acres of Virginia mountain land. The heating bills alone for the old farmhouse would consume a significant portion of her monthly budget. Insurance companies had already begun sending representatives to assess the barn's structural integrity, and their preliminary reports used words like liability and potential hazard with concerning frequency. Her cousin Miguel, Antonio's nephew who lived in Arlington and worked for a real estate development firm, had been calling twice a week since the funeral. His advice was consistent and practical. Sophia, you're being sentimental about this. The land is worth good money. These mountain properties are hot right now with people from DC looking for weekend places. But that barn is dragging down the value. Tear it down, subdivide the acreage, and you could walk away with enough money to buy a nice house in Richmond and still have plenty left over for retirement. The sentiment was echoed by nearly everyone who'd visited the property since Antonio's death. The funeral director, making conversation during the service planning, had mentioned that several families in the county had profited handsomely from selling inherited farmland to developers. The pastor at St. Catherine's, where Antonio had attended Mass every Sunday for 2 decades, gently suggested that perhaps the money from a sale could be put toward charitable causes that would honor her grandfather's memory more meaningfully than maintaining an empty barn in the mountains. Act 2. The community's assessment. The professional opinions were even more decisive. Rebecca Thornton, the real estate agent who'd driven up from Harrisonburg to assess the property, spent less than 20 minutes walking the grounds before delivering her verdict. She stood in the barn's enormous central bay, her designer heels clicking against the worn wooden planks as she made notes on a tablet computer. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through gaps between the weathered boards, and somewhere in the rafters above, pigeons cooed with the lazy contentment of creatures who'd claimed this space as their own. "I'll be honest with you," Rebecca said, not looking up from her screen. "The house has potential, good bones, authentic period details, the kind of character that appeals to buyers looking for country charm. But this barn is a different story entirely. The foundation is stone and mortar from the 1950s, which means it's probably settling unevenly. The roof needs complete replacement. I can see daylight through the boards in at least 3 places. The electrical system, if there even is one, would need to be brought up to current codes before anyone could use this space for anything." She gestured toward the far end of the structure, where farm equipment from decades past sat beneath canvas tarps like sleeping giants. "And then there's the question of what to do with all this accumulated. Well, let's call it memorabilia. Your grandfather was obviously a man who had trouble letting go of things. I've seen this before with older property owners. They save everything because they lived through times when everything had value, when you repaired things instead of replacing them. But the reality is, most of this would cost more to haul away than it's worth." Rebecca's assessment continued as they walked the perimeter of the barn. The structure measured roughly 60 feet by 40 feet, with a traditional gambrel roof that had once been painted red but had faded to the color of dried clay. The main doors, wide enough to accommodate a hay wagon, hung slightly askew on their tracks. Smaller doors on the side walls provided access to what had once been stalls for livestock. The entire building leaned almost imperceptibly to the south, as if tired of standing upright after 7 decades of supporting the weight of other people's possessions. "My recommendation would be to get quotes from demolition companies," Rebecca concluded, closing her tablet with a decisive snap. "Clean up the lot, maybe keep a few of the larger trees for character, and market it as a building site with mountain views. You'd probably get 3 times as much interest from buyers, and the sale price would more than offset the cost of removal." The neighbors who'd known Antonio offered similar advice, though delivered with more warmth and personal history. Earl Hutchinson, whose family had farmed the adjacent property for 4 generations, stopped by on a Thursday evening while Sophia was sorting through her grandfather's papers. He stood in the barn doorway, his own weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the accumulated possessions that filled the space from floor to rafters. "Your grandfather was a good man," Earl said, his voice carrying the slow cadence of someone who'd spent decades choosing his words carefully. "Helped me out more times than I can count, lending tools, sharing equipment when mine broke down, always willing to pitch in during hay season even after he'd retired from the railroad. But Antonio could never throw anything away. Came from growing up during the Depression, I think. His generation learned to save everything because you never knew when it might come in handy." Earl pointed toward a corner where several pieces of farm machinery sat beneath dust covers. "That cultivator there. He bought it at auction 15 years ago, said he was going to restore it for a museum display. Never did touch it, far as I know. And those stacks of lumber? Been sitting there since he tore down the old chicken coop back in '98. Good intentions, but sometimes good intentions just turn into clutter." The antique dealer who'd responded to Sophia's advertisement in the local paper was more direct in her assessment. Janet Kowalski owned a shop in Staunton that specialized in rural Americana, and she'd driven out on a Saturday morning with high hopes and a cargo van. She spent 2 hours methodically examining furniture, tools, household items, and the various collections that Antonio had accumulated over the decades. "There are a few pieces with some value," Janet admitted as she prepared to leave, her van nearly empty. "That brass oil lamp from the kitchen is probably 1920s, worth maybe $40 or $50 to the right collector. And I took those hand-forged horseshoes. Blacksmith work from that era has a market among people decorating country homes. But most of what you've got here is more sentimental than commercial. A lot of love and memories attached to these things, but not much that would bring significant money." She paused at her van door, looking back toward the barn with the sympathetic expression of someone who delivered similar news many times before. My advice: keep whatever has personal meaning. Donate what you can to charity for the tax deduction, and hire a cleanup service for the rest. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a loved one's possessions is to let them go to people who'll actually use them. Act 3. Sophia's resistance and decision. Despite the chorus of practical voices urging her to clear out and sell, Sophia found herself drawn back to the property weekend after weekend. There was something about the barn that defied the easy categorization everyone else seemed so confident about. Standing in its cavernous interior on quiet Sunday afternoons, she felt connected to the grandfather who'd shaped so much of her character during those formative summer visits. Every item in this space had been placed here deliberately, whether out of necessity, hope, or simply the inability to discard things that carried memory. She remembered helping Antonio organize his workshop area when she was 14, learning to sort different types of nails into baby food jars he'd saved for decades. He'd taught her to identify various wood grains, to understand the difference between hand tools and power tools, to appreciate the craftsmanship that went into objects built to last for generations rather than seasons. Everything here has a story, he'd told her as they worked together one afternoon, the summer heat making the barn feel like a wooden oven. Most people look at old things and see junk, but if you know how to look, you can see the hands that made them, the problems they solved, the care that went into keeping them working. Antonio had been methodical in everything: his approach to railroad scheduling, his maintenance of the farmhouse, his careful cataloging of household expenses in spiral notebooks that dated back to the 1960s. He'd labeled storage boxes with the precision of a librarian, kept detailed records of when and where he'd acquired various tools, and maintained an inventory system that would have impressed the most organized warehouse manager. It seemed impossible that a man who approached everything else with such systematic care would have simply thrown possessions into the barn without some underlying logic. Her professional instincts as a librarian reinforced this conviction. Sophia had spent her career helping researchers navigate through seemingly chaotic collections of historical documents, finding patterns and connections that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. She'd learned to read the organizational systems that previous archivists had imposed on manuscript collections, to understand the logic behind filing systems that initially appeared random or obsolete. Looking at the barn's contents with those same analytical skills, she began to see evidence of intention rather than mere accumulation. The farm equipment, for instance, wasn't scattered randomly throughout the space. Older pieces occupied the eastern wall, while more recent acquisitions were positioned near the main doors. Hand tools were grouped by function in clearly labeled cabinets that Antonio had built himself. Even the stacks of lumber were sorted by species and dimension, with cedar separated from pine, 2x4s distinct from 2x6s. This wasn't the chaotic hoarding that everyone else described. It was the systematic preservation of resources by a man who understood the value of preparedness. On her fourth weekend at the property, Sophia made the decision that would change everything. Instead of hiring a cleanup crew to clear out the barn's contents, she would sort through everything herself. She told herself it was about honoring Antonio's memory, about understanding the full scope of the legacy he'd left behind. But deeper motivations drove her choice. The same curiosity that made her excellent at archival research, the need to understand the story behind the artifacts before determining their fate. She arrived early on a crisp Saturday morning in November, armed with work gloves, a thermos of coffee, and Luna, her border collie mix who'd been Antonio's favorite during their visits to the farm. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense Sophia's moods and energy levels, and this morning Luna seemed to understand that they were embarking on something significant. She bounded from the car with unusual enthusiasm, immediately beginning to investigate the fascinating array of scents around the barn's perimeter. The morning air carried the clean bite of approaching winter, sharp with the smell of wood smoke from neighboring properties and the earthy scent of leaves decomposing in the surrounding forest. The barn doors, which had resisted her previous attempts to open them completely, finally yielded to her determined effort. They slid back on their iron tracks with a prolonged groan that echoed across the valley, a sound that seemed to announce the beginning of something long overdue. Sunlight flooded into the interior, illuminating the scope of her grandfather's accumulation more clearly than she'd ever seen it before. The barn was organized into rough zones. Workshop area along the north wall, furniture storage in the central bay, farm equipment positioned near the large doors for easy access. Towers of cardboard boxes rose toward the rafters like the skyline of a miniature city built from memory and hope. Canvas tarps covered mysterious shapes throughout the space, creating a landscape of hidden possibilities. Act 4. The Systematic Exploration. Sophia began her exploration systematically, starting with the nearest stack of clearly labeled boxes. Antonio's handwriting was immediately recognizable, the careful block letters he'd used on railroad manifests for 4 decades, precise and legible even when written with a pencil stub. Christmas decorations 1985 to 2010, read one box, which contained not just holiday ornaments, but carefully wrapped figurines from the elaborate nativity scene he'd displayed every December, complete with newspaper clippings documenting which pieces had been added in which years. Another box labeled Kitchen. Carmen's things held items that had belonged to Sophia's grandmother, preserved with the reverence of a museum curator. Delicate china cups wrapped in tissue paper, recipe cards written in fading ink, a meat grinder that attached to the edge of a table and had probably been used to prepare countless family meals during the early years of their marriage. Each item carried the weight of domestic history, the accumulated evidence of a life lived with attention to detail and appreciation for quality. Hours passed in a rhythm of discovery and decision-making. Some items clearly belonged in the keep pile, family photographs in frames that had been handmade by Antonio himself, his collection of railroad memorabilia including a conductor's lantern that still held kerosene, tools that remained sharp and functional despite decades of storage. Others went into bags destined for donation, clothing that still carried the faint scent of his aftershave, household items that were well-made but duplicated items she already owned, books on subjects that no longer interested anyone in the family. A third category emerged as the day progressed, items that seemed valuable but whose significance wasn't immediately apparent. A wooden crate filled with leather-bound journals written in Spanish, documenting what appeared to be business transactions or possibly farm operations. A collection of surveying equipment that looked professional and expensive, stored in a custom-made case with his initials burned into the leather. Maps of Virginia and surrounding states, some dating back to the 1940s, marked with pencil notations and routes highlighted in red ink. It was late afternoon, when the November sun was beginning its early descent behind the mountains, that Luna began exhibiting the behavior that would change everything. The dog had been content to explore the barn's perimeter and occasionally investigate interesting scents among the stored items. But suddenly she was alert and focused, her border collie instincts engaged in a way that suggested she'd detected something significant. Luna trotted toward the far end of the barn, where several large canvas tarps hung from the rafters like curtains concealing a stage. Her tail was rigid with attention, and she emitted a low whine that Sophia had learned to associate with the dog's discovery of something unusual. Luna began pawing at the edge of one particularly large tarp, her behavior indicating that whatever lay beneath was worth investigating. Act 5. The Hidden Discovery. Sophia followed her dog's focused attention to the shadowy rear corner of the barn, where the afternoon light barely penetrated. Even in the dim illumination, she could see that the tarps concealed something substantial, shapes that were too regular and angular to be farm equipment or furniture. Luna was now sitting at attention, the way she'd been trained to indicate the location of a hidden object during the agility training they'd done together. Working carefully, Sophia began to remove the tarps. The first one came away to reveal a chrome bumper that gleamed despite the dusty environment, polished to mirror brightness and free of the corrosion that might be expected after decades in an unheated barn. Her heart began to race as she pulled away more of the covering, revealing the front end of an automobile. Not just any car, but a classic muscle car that looked as if it had just rolled off a showroom floor. Continuing to work with increasing excitement, she removed all the protective coverings to reveal a complete 1969 Dodge Charger R/T in deep metallic green, its paint job immaculate, and its chrome accessories gleaming in the filtered light. The car sat on 4 perfectly maintained tires, its interior visible through windows so clean they seemed almost invisible. This wasn't a project car or a restoration in progress. This was a fully functional classic automobile that had been kept in museum-quality condition. Sophia walked around the vehicle slowly, running her fingers along paint that felt smooth as glass, peering through windows at an interior that showed no signs of wear or aging. The black vinyl seats looked supple and new, the dashboard was dust-free, and the carpet appeared to have been recently vacuumed. Someone, obviously Antonio, had been maintaining this car with obsessive care, keeping it ready for immediate use despite storing it in secret. The keys were what finally convinced her that this discovery was more than just a hidden classic car. They hung from the ignition switch, attached to a simple key ring that held a small medallion she didn't recognize, a circular piece of metal engraved with symbols that looked vaguely Native American but could have been something else entirely. Without hesitation, she opened the driver's door and slipped behind the wheel. The leather seat embraced her with surprising comfort, and the interior smelled of high-quality materials and careful maintenance rather than age and neglect. She turned the key experimentally, and the engine responded immediately with a deep, powerful rumble that filled the barn with sound and vibration. The fuel gauge showed a full tank, the oil pressure was perfect, and every system seemed to be in ideal working condition. Act 6. The Map and the Mystery. Still seated behind the wheel of the perfectly maintained Charger, Sophia opened the glove compartment out of curiosity, expecting to find registration papers or an owner's manual that might explain how her grandfather had acquired such a valuable automobile. Instead, her fingers encountered something unexpected, a folded piece of heavy paper that felt different from ordinary documents. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map that had been created with the same meticulous attention to detail that Antonio brought to all his projects. The map showed mountain roads and landmarks throughout central Virginia, with particular focus on areas of Shenandoah National Park and the surrounding George Washington National Forest. Red X's marked specific locations, each accompanied by dates written in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. The dates stretched back over 15 years, beginning in 2008, and continuing until just 3 months before Antonio's death in the spring. Some locations were marked multiple times, suggesting return visits or ongoing activity at those sites. Geographic features were labeled in both English and Spanish, and elevation markers indicated that most of the marked locations were in remote, mountainous terrain accessible only by hiking trails or forestry roads. At the bottom of the map, in the same careful script that had labeled thousands of storage boxes and railroad manifests, was a message that made Sophia's hands tremble. Mija, when you find this, follow the northern route first. The truth about our family is waiting at the coordinates marked with the double star. What I could never tell you while I lived, you must discover for yourself. Trust no one else with this knowledge until you understand what it means. Abuelo Antonio. The coordinates referenced by the double star were located approximately 40 miles northeast of the farm, deep in a section of national forest that Sophia had never explored. The route to reach them was clearly marked on the map, following back roads and forestry trails that wound through some of the most remote terrain in Virginia. A small notation in the margin indicated that the journey would require a vehicle capable of handling rough terrain and that the final approach would need to be made on foot. Sophia sat in the driver's seat of the hidden Charger, holding the mysterious map and trying to process the implications of what she'd discovered. Her grandfather, the methodical railroad foreman who'd lived a quiet, predictable life in retirement, had apparently been making secret expeditions into the wilderness for over a decade. He'd maintained a classic muscle car in perfect condition specifically for these trips, and whatever he'd been doing was significant enough that he'd felt compelled to document it carefully and pass the information on to her after his death. The shadows were lengthening outside the barn as November's short day began to fade into twilight. Luna whined softly from her position near the barn doors, sensing her owner's emotional state and the weight of the discovery they'd made together. Somewhere in the surrounding forest, an owl called once, then fell silent, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the bare branches of oak and maple trees. As Sophia carefully folded the map and slipped it into her jacket pocket, she realized that everything had changed. This wasn't just about cleaning out a barn or deciding whether to keep inherited property. Her grandfather had left her something far more complex than real estate and possessions. He'd left her a mystery that had apparently consumed 15 years of his life, and a responsibility to uncover truths that he'd been unable or unwilling to share while he was alive. The Charger's keys felt warm in her hand as she stepped out of the car and back into the barn's dusty reality. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to follow the route marked on the map or whether some family secrets were meant to remain buried in the mountains of Virginia. But as she looked at the perfectly maintained muscle car that had been hidden in plain sight for so many years, she knew that her grandfather had been preparing her for this moment since she was a child learning to sort nails in his workshop. Sophia followed the map to the mountain coordinates, where she discovered a hidden cave containing stolen artifacts her grandfather had been secretly returning to their rightful indigenous communities for 15 years. The Charger was his getaway vehicle for these covert repatriation missions. Documents revealed he'd learned about illegal artifact trafficking through his railroad connections and dedicated his retirement to making things right. The map led to his final cache, priceless ceremonial items waiting to be returned. Sophia realized her inheritance wasn't just property, but a moral mission. She drove the Charger to complete his work, understanding that some legacies are about justice, not wealth. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what you can sell, but what you're called to protect. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes.